Every lie has a weight to it. Some are light enough that you carry them without noticing, tucked between the ordinary things of your day like a folded receipt in your jacket pocket. Others press down on you from the moment you speak them, and you spend every hour afterward wondering when the weight will finally break you open. Mine started with 4 words: "There is no father." I said them to my mother first, on a Thursday evening in my childhood kitchen, while she was washing dishes, and I was sitting at the table with my hands folded around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The window above the sink was fogged from the steam, and outside the neighborhood was going quiet, the way it always did in late autumn, the last of the leaves coming down, the sky turning the color of old pewter. She turned around slowly, dish towel in her hands. "What do you mean there is no father?" "I mean what I said." I kept my voice level. I had practiced this, standing in front of the bathroom mirror for 3 mornings in a row. I was at a clinic. It was a decision I made on my own. There is no father. The silence between us lasted a long time. I watched her face move through several expressions: shock, confusion, something close to grief, and then finally, a careful rearranging into the particular kind of calm my mother produced whenever she had decided to hold something together. "Are you sure?" she asked. "About which part?" "Any of it." I looked down at my cold tea. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. I thought about Callum. I thought about his hands and his voice and the way he had looked at me across a crowded room 8 months ago, like I was the only fixed point in a turning world. I thought about everything that had happened since, and everything I had walked away from. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." That was the beginning of the lie. His name was Callum Ashford, and I had met him at the worst possible moment in both our lives. I need to explain something about omegas before I explain anything else, because the world I live in requires a particular kind of context. We are not fragile creatures, whatever the old books say. We do not spend our lives in gentle waiting rooms, hoping to be chosen. Most of us build careers and relationships and full, complicated existences. And the biological architecture we were born with is simply one part of who we are. The way anyone's body is one part of who they are. I had lived 29 years being an omega, the same way I lived being left-handed or being allergic to certain grasses, as a fact that required occasional management, not a destiny that consumed everything else. But there are limits. I will not pretend there are not limits. My heat cycles had always been manageable with suppressants, until the year I turned 29, and my body apparently decided the suppressants were optional. My doctor had warned me this could happen, that some omegas developed a tolerance over time, that we might need to adjust dosages or try different formulations. I had made an appointment to discuss it, and then my best friend Declan had called me and said he was getting married and he needed me in the wedding party, and could I please come to the engagement party this weekend. I went to the engagement party. Callum Ashford was the groom's older brother. I noticed him the way you notice a shift in pressure before a storm, before you've consciously registered any change in the sky. I was standing by the drinks table talking to Declan's mother when something in the air around me changed, and I turned my head, and there he was across the room. Tall. Dark hair that wanted to curl but had been combed into something more ordered. A jaw like a proposition. Eyes that were some complicated color between gray and green that I would spend months trying to name accurately. He was wearing a navy jacket that fit him too well to have been anything but bespoke, and he was holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. And he was looking at something across the room with an expression of contained intensity that I found instantly inconveniently interesting. Then he turned his head and he looked at me. I had been looked at by alphas before. I am not going to be precious about what that usually feels like. There is a biological dimension to it, an awareness that functions somewhere below thought. But this was different in a way I could not immediately categorize. He did not look at me the way most alphas look at an omega they've scented. He looked at me the way you look at something you recognize from a long time ago, something you thought you had lost or maybe dreamed. I looked away first. I went back to talking to Declan's mother about her garden. But then somehow, by the ordinary machinery of parties, we ended up near each other again. He was talking to his brother, Declan's fiancé Oliver. And I was talking to Declan, and the four of us began talking together, and within 10 minutes I had learned that Callum Ashford was 34 years old, that he ran an architectural firm his grandfather had founded, that he had a dry sense of humor he deployed with the timing of someone who'd been practicing it for years, and that when he laughed at something genuinely funny, the contained intensity of his face broke open into something so warm it was almost startling. "You two should exchange numbers," Declan said at some point, in the cheerful, managing way Declan had always had about him. "You're both impossibly particular about coffee, and you both hate small talk. You'll either become best friends or destroy each other." Callum looked at me with a faint smile. "I don't actually hate small talk," he said. "I just refuse to pretend it's interesting." "That's exactly what hating small talk means," I said. He smiled properly then. "Fair point. I'm Callum. Elliot." We shook hands. His grip was firm and brief and warm, and afterward I could still feel the particular temperature of his palm, and I thought, with the specific clarity of someone who has made a very serious error in judgment, this is going to be a problem. What happened next is something I have told in pieces and never in full, and I think to make sense of everything that followed, I need to tell it in full, now at least to myself, even if no one else is listening. The party ended. I went home to my flat, a second-floor apartment in a building I liked for its tall windows and its complete absence of personality, which I found restful after the intensity of being around people. I made tea. I went to bed. I thought about the way Callum Ashford had looked at me and decided firmly that I was not going to do anything about it. The problem was that I had missed a dose of suppressants during the chaos of the previous week, and then missed another one because the pharmacy had been out of my particular formulation and the replacement took 4 days to arrive. By the time I came home from that party, I was already on the edge of a cycle, and the presence of an alpha who made the air change had pushed me closer to that edge than I realized. I woke up at 2 in the morning feeling like I was on fire. I am not going to be melodramatic about it. Heat is heat. The body wants what it wants with a persistence that overrides most rational thought, and I had handled solo heats before with suppressants and patience and a willingness to be miserable for 3 to 4 days. I took what suppressants I had left, which were not enough, and I called my heat management service, which is exactly what it sounds like, a service for omegas who need assistance during cycles without a partner, and they told me the earliest they could send someone was morning. I managed through the night alone. By 6 in the morning, I was in a state I had never quite been in before. The suppressants had taken the edge off, but not enough, and there was a particular deeply inconvenient fact presenting itself to me, which was that I had Callum Ashford's number in my phone. Declan, helpful as ever, had actually sent it to me the previous night with a message that said, "Just in case you need it," followed by a winking face that I had found irritating until this exact moment. I stared at his name in my contacts for a long time. I want to be clear that what I did next was not a decision made with my full rational faculties, but I also want to be clear that it was still a decision. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was asking. I called him. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, and his voice was low and careful when he said my name. "Elliot." "I'm sorry to call so early," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I'm having a situation." A pause. What kind of situation? The kind where I missed some medication and the heat management service isn't available until morning, and I stopped. Tried again. "I shouldn't have called. I'm going to hang up." "Don't hang up." His voice was very quiet. "Tell me your address." "Callum, I don't even know you." "You know enough. Tell me your address." I told him my address. He arrived 30 minutes later, which meant he had been living somewhere nearby, which I thought about for a fraction of a second before I opened the door, and the scent of him hit me like stepping into warm water. And then I stopped thinking about geography. What followed was 3 days. I will not recount them in clinical detail because this is not that kind of story. What I will say is that Callum was careful. He was attentive in a way that felt almost contradictory to the urgency of the situation, pausing to check on me, making sure I ate, bringing water and asking quietly what I needed, and then providing it without making me feel like an emergency. He was managing. He slept with his arms around me and didn't make me feel like I was being held down. In the moments when heat ebbed enough for conversation, he talked to me the way he had at the party, directly, with dry humor, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel like the only thing in the room. On the third day, when the heat had passed, and I was lying in clean sheets feeling wrung out and clear-headed, he was sitting at my kitchen table making tea as though he'd always known where I kept things. And I watched him from the doorway and thought, I am going to fall in love with this man if I am not extremely careful. He looked up and saw me standing there. You should eat something, he said. You've been saying that for 3 days. You've been forgetting it for 3 days. He set a mug on the counter and nodded at it. Come sit down. I sat down. He put toast in front of me and sat across from me with his own tea, and we were quiet for a while in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside my tall, characterless windows, the morning was coming in gray and pale. Thank you, I said finally. I know this wasn't. Don't. His voice was gentle but definite. You don't need to frame this as something I did for you. I was here because I wanted to be here. I looked at him across the table. We don't actually know each other. I know. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I'd like to change that, if you're open to it. I looked at my toast. I thought about how easy it would be, and how dangerous easy things had always been for me. I thought about how I had spent the last 3 days being held by someone who made me feel simultaneously safe and undone, and how in my experience, those two feelings occurring together was the beginning of something that ended with damage. I'm not sure that's a good idea, I said. He didn't push. That was the thing about Callum. He never pushed. He nodded once, slowly, like he was accepting something that had been offered to him honestly, and he said, all right. He left that afternoon. He texted me once, 2 days later, to ask if I was doing okay. I said yes. He said good. And then we didn't speak for a week, and then 2 weeks, and I told myself that was the right outcome. The positive test came 4 weeks later. I sat on the edge of my bathtub with 2 separate tests in my hands, staring at the same result on both of them for a very long time. There is a particular kind of silence that a revelation produces, not external silence. My upstairs neighbor was moving furniture, and the street outside was full of its ordinary noise, but an internal stillness, as though every process inside me had paused to evaluate new information before deciding how to proceed. I was pregnant. By a man I had spent 3 days with, by a man who had looked at me across a party like he recognized me from somewhere, whose hands were warm and careful, whose voice in the morning was low and deliberate. By a man I had told, kindly, clearly, with full intent, that getting to know each other was not a good idea. The stillness held for a long time. And then, with a speed and clarity that surprised me, I made a decision. I was keeping it. The other decision, the one about Callum, took longer and was harder, and I made it at 2 in the morning sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, which is apparently where I make all my most consequential choices. He deserved to know. I understood that. I sat with that truth for a long time, turning it over, examining it from all its sides. He deserved to know. And knowing that, I also had to ask myself, what would happen if he did know? What kind of man was Callum Ashford really? I had spent 3 days with him in the most intimate possible circumstances, and I still could not claim to know his character with any confidence. Alphas who seemed careful and attentive in one context could be something entirely different in another. I had seen enough of that in the lives around me to be cautious. But more than fear of who he might be, there was something else. Something smaller and harder to name. If I told him, and he wanted to be involved, really involved, the way his voice and his hands suggested he might, then what happened to the decision I had already made? My decision. The one I had made alone, clearly, with my whole self, sitting on the edge of the bathtub. I did not want it to become his decision. I did not want to spend the next 9 months watching someone else's needs reshape mine. I know how that sounds. I have had conversations with myself about it, long and uncomfortable conversations in which I play both parts, and I have not always come out ahead. I am not telling you it was the right choice. I am telling you it was the choice I made, with the information and the self I had at the time, at 2 in the morning in a cold kitchen. I did not call Callum. I went to my doctor. I started prenatal vitamins. I told Declan because Declan was my best friend and because not telling him would have required a different kind of deception entirely. Declan sat across from me in his living room and listened to the whole story with the particular focused stillness that meant he was working very hard not to react until I had finished. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. His brother is marrying my Oliver in 7 months, he said. I know. You're pregnant with his brothers. I know, Declan. Elliot. I know. He pressed his hands over his face. Then he dropped them and looked at me with an expression that was more complicated than I deserved and less reproachful than I expected. What are you going to do? I'm going to have a baby, I said, and I'm going to tell people there is no father. And Callum? The name landed in the air between us with a weight I hadn't anticipated. Callum doesn't need to be part of this, I said. We barely know each other. This was a biological incident that had consequences. I am fully capable of handling the consequences. Declan stared at me for a long time. Do you believe that? I met his eyes. I have to. He looked away. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he did when he had decided to support something he didn't fully agree with. Okay, he said. Okay, then what do you need? That was why Declan was my best friend. Company, I said. And for you to not tell your fiancé. Another long pause. Oliver tells Callum everything. I know. Which is why you cannot tell Oliver. Declan looked deeply uncomfortable. Elliot, you're asking me to keep a secret from my partner for a finite period until I figure out the right way to handle this. And when is that? I looked at the window. Outside, the day was moving on without me, ordinary and indifferent. I don't know yet. Pregnancy, as it turned out, was the most physically demanding thing I had ever done, and I had once hiked a mountain route that required actual ropes. The first trimester was violent. I will not romanticize it. I was ill every morning and some afternoons, and occasionally in the evenings for good measure. I lost 4 pounds before I gained them back, and then more. My sense of smell, already somewhat heightened as an omega, became almost unbearable. I threw out my entire collection of scented candles, banned 3 of my coworkers from wearing certain products near me, and could tell what my upstairs neighbor was cooking from 2 floors down with closed windows. I continued going to work because I was the director of a small but well-regarded environmental consulting firm, and there was no version of myself that didn't continue going to work. But I kept a small bag in my desk drawer for emergencies. My mother, once she had processed the initial shock of my announcement, became unexpectedly and fiercely useful. She arrived at my flat the following Saturday with a casserole, a bag of ginger supplements, and a firm intention to stay for the weekend that extended into most of the next 2 months. She had opinions about everything: my diet, my sleep schedule, the temperature of my apartment, the reliability of my doctor, and she communicated them with a direct efficiency that I had always found either comforting or maddening depending on the day. During those months, mostly I found it comforting. You look tired, she said every morning as a greeting. Thank you, Mom. Have you been sleeping? I've been trying. Are you thinking too much at night? When am I not thinking too much? She would click her tongue and pour tea, and we would sit across from each other in my kitchen, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was one of those quiet domestic arrangements that sustains you without announcing itself, and I was grateful for it even when it made me feel like I was 14 again. I was 16 weeks along when Declan's wedding arrived. Oliver's family was warm and enthusiastic and entirely too large for the venue they had chosen, which meant the overflow of relatives filled every available corner, and the noise level throughout the ceremony and reception was something between festive and overwhelming. I was visibly pregnant by then, Not enormously so, but unmistakably. The dress I wore to accommodate it was deep green, and I had chosen it partly for coverage and partly because Declan had texted me that it would look good against the floral arrangements, which was correct. I stood at the front of the room next to Declan through the ceremony and watched Oliver Ashford promise himself to my best friend, and I smiled genuinely because it was genuinely moving. And I was doing extremely well up until the moment the ceremony ended, and I turned, and there was Callum, standing in the front row of the assembled guests. I had known he would be there. Of course I had known he would be there. He was the groom's older brother. He was the best man on Oliver's side. What I had not allowed myself to fully account for was what it would feel like to see him in person for the first time since that morning in my kitchen, when he had put toast in front of me and asked with his eyes if I would let him stay. He was wearing a dark suit and a tie, the color of winter sky, and he looked exactly as I remembered him, and also entirely different in the way people are different when you have been carrying them in your mind for months, when the version of them in your head has become both more and less than the actual person. He saw me. The look on his face was complicated, surprised, obviously, something underneath the surprise that moved through his expression too quickly for me to read. Then his gaze dropped to the visible curve of my stomach, and the surprise deepened into something else, something careful. He looked back up at my face. I looked back at him. I held myself completely still, the way I had learned to hold myself when I needed something not to show. Then other people were moving between us, the reception beginning its organized chaos, and I turned away and went to find my seat. He found me at the drinks table an hour and a half later. I had known he would. I had been both dreading and, somewhere beneath the dread, waiting for it with the specific readiness of someone who has been preparing for an inevitable conversation. He came to stand beside me, close enough to talk quietly in the noise of the room, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He poured himself a glass of water, and I refilled my own, and we stood looking at the room full of celebrating people. "Congratulations to your brother," I said, "and to yours, to Declan." A pause. "You look well." "Thank you." Another pause, longer. The room hummed around us. "How far along?" he asked. My hand tightened slightly on my glass. 19 weeks. The arithmetic was quiet but loud. I watched it land. "Elliot." His voice was very low, very controlled. "Is it?" "Yes." The single syllable fell between us. I watched his jaw move, watched him process something he was containing with visible effort. "You should have told me," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" I looked at the room. The lights were warm, and the music was something soft, and the wedding guests were moving in their lovely, ordinary patterns, glasses raised, laughter breaking in waves. Declan was across the room dancing with Oliver, and they were both beaming in the particular way of people who have arrived somewhere they were traveling toward for a long time. "I wasn't ready," I said finally, "and I needed it to be mine first." Silence. "It is yours first," he said. "It will always be yours first. That isn't something I would take from you." I looked at him then, and his face was. I still cannot fully describe what his face was in that moment. It was not anger, though I think I might have found anger easier. It was something more complex than anger. It was the face of someone who is hurting and has decided that their hurting is secondary to something else. "I'm going to want to be involved," he said. "I need you to know that. Not because of biology, because this is—" He stopped, started again. "I thought about you, after that morning. More than I probably should have, given what you said. And I'm telling you now so that you're not surprised later." My chest did something uncomfortable. "Callum, I'm not asking for anything right now. I'm telling you something true so that we're starting from the same information." His voice was steady. "You can decide what to do with it." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. This close, the particular color of his eyes was gray with green at the edges, like deep water with light coming through it. "Okay," I said. Okay, I hear you." He nodded once. That's all I wanted. He stepped away from the drinks table, back into the party, and I stood there with my water for a while and breathed. What followed was not simple. because nothing involving two stubborn people with different ideas of appropriate emotional disclosure was ever going to be simple, but it was. In its complicated, incremental, frequently frustrating way, progress. Callum texted me 2 days after the wedding. Not about the pregnancy. About a documentary he'd seen that reminded him of something I'd said at the party about urban green space planning before any of this had happened. It was such a specific, careful opening that I stared at it for 5 minutes before I understood what he was doing. He was giving me the choice of where to begin. I texted back about the documentary. We texted about other things. Urban design, architecture, which was his field, and which I found genuinely interesting in ways that surprised me when I examined them. The particular misery of conference calls. Books. The precise taxonomy of bad coffee. It was careful, and it was slow, and it was deeply unlike any courtship I had engaged in, possibly because I was not certain it was a courtship and he was not calling it one. He asked if he could come to an ultrasound. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days and then said yes. He met me at the clinic at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning. He was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, and he was holding 2 coffees, one of which he handed to me with a solemnity that was slightly undercut by the fact that it was a decaf in a cup designed to look identical to regular coffee so that I wouldn't feel left out, which I only knew because I had watched him carry out this plan with scrupulous sincerity. "You found the right kind," I said, looking at the cup. It took 3 phone calls. He said it without inflection. Something turned over in my chest. We sat in the waiting room with our coffees and didn't say much. He was good at comfortable silences, I had discovered. Not everyone is. Some people treat silence as a gap that must be filled before it becomes accusatory. Callum treated it like shared weather, something you simply existed in together. The scan was the 20-week anatomy scan, which is longer and more detailed than the early ones. And the technician was brisk and efficient and narrated what she was looking for in the manner of someone doing a very technical thing very well. I lay there in the dim room staring at the ceiling while she worked, and then the screen came alive with the fuzzy moving picture of a small life doing small life things, a hand moving near a face, a curve of spine, the rapid flicker of a heartbeat. Callum said nothing, but I heard his breath change beside me. When we came out into the morning afterward, we stood on the pavement with the printed scan image in my hand, and Callum was very quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness, fuller somehow. "Healthy?" he asked. "Completely," I said. "Everything is where it's supposed to be." He nodded slowly. Then he said, very quietly, "Can I see?" I held out the image. He took it carefully, with both hands, and stood there looking at it for a long moment. "That's a person," he said. "Yes, that's—" He stopped. He looked up, and his face was entirely unguarded in a way I had not seen before, the contained intensity entirely absent, leaving something much simpler underneath. "Are you all right?" I asked. "No," he said, and then, "Yes, both." I understood that. We had our first real fight at 24 weeks, which I think is probably around the time most people in unexpected co-parenting situations have their first real fight. Once the careful early negotiations have given way to the actual friction of navigating genuinely different positions. It was about the birth plan, or rather, it was ostensibly about the birth plan. Underneath the birth plan, it was about control and fear. And the fact that I had spent 6 months managing this pregnancy as a solo enterprise and found it very difficult to incorporate another person's wishes and needs into the architecture I had built. And underneath that, deeper still, was something I was not yet ready to name. Callum had asked, reasonably, I can acknowledge now, whether he could be present for the delivery. "I've listed the birth space as Omega only," I said. "I know. I'm asking if you would consider changing that." "I have it arranged a particular way." "I understand. I'm asking if you would consider changing it." The repetition was deliberate. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't escalating. He was holding the same ground with the same voice, and it was, honestly, almost more frustrating than if he had simply argued with me. "Why does it matter to you to be there?" I asked. Because it's my child and you are. He stopped, edited himself visibly. Because it's my child. And because I would like to be there from the first moment. It's not just a moment, it's hours, potentially, of my body doing the most physically extreme thing it has ever done, and I need to be able to focus without managing how you're experiencing it. I'm not asking you to manage me. You wouldn't be asking me that. I would just do it. I would look at your face and I would see what you were feeling, and I would manage it without even deciding to. That's how I work, and I can't afford that energy during labor. Silence. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the table between us. What if I told you that I would not require managing, that whatever happened in that room, whatever I felt, I would contain it completely? I'd say that's not a promise anyone can make in that situation. Then let me make a different promise. He looked up. Whatever you need that room to be, I will be what you need me to be. If you need me to be invisible, I can be invisible. If you need me to hold your hand, I can do that. If you need me to leave, I will leave without argument. But I am asking you to let me try. I looked at him across the table. He looked back. The afternoon light was coming through the window of his office where we'd had this conversation, and it caught the side of his face and the particular green at the edges of his eyes, and I thought again. With the specific clarity that had visited me now several times, this is going to be a problem. I'll think about it, I said. Okay. I'm not saying yes. I know. I'm just saying I'll think about it. Elliot. His voice was very quiet. That's all I asked. I thought about it for 11 days and didn't change the birth plan, but I started leaving the possibility of changing it somewhere in the back of my mind unlocked. The way you leave a door unlocked when you're not sure yet whether you want someone to come in. The weeks between 24 and 32 were the weeks I stopped pretending. Not about the pregnancy. The pregnancy had been public knowledge for a long time by then, and I had developed a practiced equanimity about the questions people asked and the assumptions they made. Not about Callum, exactly because in the circles where I lived, his presence at the anatomy scan had not gone unnoticed, and Declan had been less than perfectly discreet about certain details, and I had started receiving texts from various people containing the particular combination of excitement and tactful non-questioning that indicated they had drawn their own conclusions. What I stopped pretending was to myself. It happened gradually, the way most important things do. A Tuesday evening, when he came to the flat to help me put together the crib that had arrived in a flat-pack box containing what appeared to be 300 individual components and an instruction manual designed with spectacular contempt for human beings. He sat on my living room floor for 2 hours, with a hex key and a focused expression and the particular quiet competence of someone who worked with structures and plans and the physical reality of how things fit together. I sat on the sofa with my swollen ankles on a cushion and handed him things when he needed them, and we talked about nothing consequential, and it was the best evening I had had in months. Not because of anything dramatic that occurred, simply because of how it felt to be in a room with him. A Thursday afternoon when I called him because I was having a bad day. Not a dangerous kind of bad day. Just the ordinary grinding kind where everything felt too heavy and too slow, and the baby was pressing on a nerve in a way that made walking painful, and I had a report due that wasn't coming together, and I was, frankly, tired of being a person. He talked to me for an hour and a half about completely unrelated things. A building he was working on, a conversation he'd had with his elderly neighbor about bird feeders, an argument he'd had with a coffee machine, until I was laughing against my will and the afternoon felt survivable again. A Saturday morning when I woke from a bad dream about the delivery, the specific, irrational kind of fear that lives in the early hours and retreats in daylight. And before I could think about it, I had reached for my phone and texted him, "Are you awake?" And he had texted back within 30 seconds, "Yes. What do you need?" Not what's wrong. Not why are you texting at this hour. What do you need? I told him about the dream. He stayed on text with me until I went back to sleep. I stopped pretending somewhere in that sequence of evenings and afternoons and early mornings. I stopped pretending that what was between us was purely pragmatic. I stopped pretending that the reason I looked forward to his texts was the information they contained rather than the fact that they were from him. I stopped pretending that the way he existed in my life, carefully, patiently, on my terms, without claiming any territory I hadn't offered him, was simply the conduct of a reasonable man and not something I had begun to depend on. I admitted to myself in the exact same bathroom where I had taken 2 positive tests. Sitting on the edge of the same bathtub at 6:30 in the morning, with the beginning of late autumn light coming through the frosted glass, I was in love with Callum Ashford. I had been building toward it since the night of a party I had attended grudgingly, when he had been standing across a room and the air had changed. I sat with that knowledge for a while, turning it over. It had weight, but a different weight than the lie I had told at the beginning. This was heavy in the way full things are heavy, not because something was wrong, but because something was real. And then I thought, he is going to be in that delivery room. I called him at 7 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. "Elliot, are you all right?" "I'm changing the birth plan," I said. Silence. "I want you there." My voice came out steady. I had not planned what I was going to say before I called, and apparently my subconscious had decided to be straightforward about it. "I want you in the room, if you still want to be." A long pause. Then, very quietly, "I still want to be." Okay. Another pause. "You could have waited until morning to tell me this." It is morning. It's 7 a.m. That's morning. I could hear the smile in the silence before he spoke again. "Are you sure?" I said it, didn't I? "You do sometimes say things as tests." "I don't." I stopped. "That's not entirely inaccurate, but this isn't a test." "All right." A breath. "Thank you for telling me." I looked at the frosted glass window. The light was getting clearer. Outside, the city was beginning its day. "Callum," I said. "Yes, I'm going to want to talk to you about some things when there's more capacity for talking." A pause that felt very particular. "I'll be here," he said, "whenever there's capacity." The last 2 months were their own country. My body was doing extraordinary things that I watched with a mixture of awe and the specific dry exhaustion of someone who has been extraordinary for too long and would like to be ordinary again, please. In the very near future. The baby was large and present and physically opinionated, with preferences about positioning that did not align with my preferences about comfort. My back had opinions about the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. My ankles had opinions about shoes. Callum came to the flat 3 evenings a week, which had started as a practical arrangement and had become something that felt structural. He brought food sometimes, though he'd learned quickly that my appetite was too unpredictable to plan for, so he had taken to bringing things that kept good breadfruit, things from the deli around the corner that I could eat or not eat without ceremony. He helped with the things I found difficult to do, which had become more numerous as my center of gravity shifted. He sat with me while I worked sometimes, reading or working on his own things from the armchair I had relocated to the living room because I had stopped being able to sit comfortably on the sofa. We talked. More and more, as the weeks went on, we talked. Not cautiously, not with the careful management of the earlier months, but the way people talk when the scaffolding has come down and they are simply in the room together. He told me about his grandfather, who had started the firm and who had died when Callum was 26, just as he was beginning to build his own ideas about architecture, and how he had carried his grandfather's aesthetic into his own work in ways that were sometimes frustrating and sometimes felt like a conversation continuing. I told him about the particular grief of my father leaving when I was 11 and how I had subsequently developed what my therapist called an elaborate system of preemptive self-sufficiency, my therapist's phrase, which I found both clinically accurate and somewhat unflattering. "Is that what you were doing?" he asked. "With me at the beginning." "Among other things," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Did it work?" I looked at him. Evidently not. He didn't smile, but something near his eyes did. "Callum," I said. "Yes, I told everyone there was no father when I first announced the pregnancy." "I know." His voice was careful. "Declan told Oliver, eventually." "I know he did." I had been mildly irritated about this at the time and had since decided it was ultimately unavoidable. And you? I paused. Were you angry? A long pause. I was hurt, he said. There's a difference. I know there's a difference. I understood why you did it, he said. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. I breathed. I'm sorry. I know you are. That's not enough, but it's not nothing either. He looked at his hands for a moment. You were scared. You made a choice from a scared place. I've done the same. I'm not keeping score. I looked at him. This man who had answered on the second ring, who had arrived with coffee already decafed, who had put together a crib for 2 hours on a living room floor, who had waited with a patience I did not deserve and had not asked him for. And I thought that I had been so focused on protecting the decision I had made alone that I had almost missed what was being built in the space between us. After, I said. I want to talk after. About what this is. He met my eyes. His were gray-green and steady. I know what it is, he said quietly. Tell me. Not yet. A faint ghost of a smile. After. As you said. My due date came and went without incident because babies have no respect for planning. The midwife reassured me that being a week past the due date was entirely normal and suggested we wait another few days before discussing induction. I spent those days in a state of physical discomfort so comprehensive that I had essentially stopped thinking about anything beyond immediate management, and Callum had shifted from 3 evenings a week to effectively most of them. Sleeping in the second bedroom I had set up as a nursery with an inflatable mattress on the floor, because the idea of being alone at 2 in the morning when labor potentially started was not one I was comfortable with anymore. Labor began on a Sunday morning at 3:30. I know the moment it started because I was already awake. I had been awake for most of the night, which had become standard, and the first real contraction arrived with a specificity that distinguished it immediately from the Braxton Hicks contractions I'd been having for weeks. There was something deliberate about it, something that said, this is different. I sat with it for 20 minutes, timing the next ones, and when they confirmed what I suspected, I got up and went down the hallway and knocked on the nursery door. Callum. A shuffling sound. I think it's starting. A longer pause. Then, alertly, I'll get dressed. You don't need to rush. They're still... Elliot. His voice from behind the closed door was very calm. I'll get dressed. I went back to my room and breathed through a contraction and thought about the fact that there was someone down the hall getting dressed to come with me, and I did not feel claustrophobic about this. I felt, unexpectedly, the specific kind of calm that comes from not being alone. We called the birth center. The midwife on call, a woman named Sharon, who had the energetic practicality of someone who had done this many hundreds of times and found it no less significant for the repetition, told us to come in when contractions were 5 minutes apart, and I was finding it difficult to talk through them. At the time of calling, they were 9 minutes apart, and I was managing fine. Callum made tea. We sat at my kitchen table in the dark of the very early morning and drank it, and he timed contractions on his phone with the same focused calm he brought to everything, and we talked, occasionally, about nothing important. Are you scared? He asked at one point. Not about the labor, I said. Ask me again in 4 hours. About what then? I looked at my tea. After, I said. What comes after? The good kind of scared or the good kind, I said, before he could finish. The kind that means something is real. He looked at me across the table, and I looked back, and neither of us said what was clearly available to be said because we had agreed to save it for after. And I was beginning to understand that after was very close now, 7 minutes apart. 5, 4, time to go, Callum said. The birth center was quiet at the hour we arrived, which was still very early morning. The sky outside the windows beginning to shift from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn. Sharon met us and settled me into the room that had been arranged for the birth, and the next several hours were the most physically extreme of my life. And I am not going to recount them in detail, because they belong to me and to Callum and to the small, furious person who arrived in the world just before 8 in the morning. Though I will say this. Callum was exactly what he had promised to be. Not invisible. I did not need invisible. I needed a hand to hold through the worst of it. And he gave me his hand, and I held it with a force that I thought might be damaging, and he did not flinch or pull away or say anything. He simply held back with equal steadiness and let me anchor myself to him. When I needed him to stop talking, he stopped talking. When I needed him to say something, he found the right things without being asked, quiet and direct and honest, not false reassurance or performative calm, but actual, grounded presence in the room. When the moment came, when Sharon said that was it, one more, and the world compressed to the single enormous fact of a new person arriving. Callum made a sound that I had never heard him make. Just a short sound, barely audible. The sound of someone being broken open by something they were not prepared for, even though they had been preparing for it for months. I was not looking at him. I was looking at my daughter. But I heard it, and I filed it away in the part of me that was already writing the story of this. The part that would eventually be able to look at the whole arc of it and see where all the threads had been going. She was 8 pounds and 2 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair and the particular deep, unfocused blue that very new eyes always have, and a sound like a very small, very committed alarm. Sharon placed her on my chest and I held her, and I was crying, which I had not planned to do, and I did not care at all about the unplanned crying. After a moment, I looked up. Callum was standing a few feet away, by the window where the early morning light was coming through, and he was not pretending to be composed. His eyes were bright with it, and he was watching the two of us with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone who has arrived somewhere they had not quite believed they would reach. "Come here," I said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed, and I shifted carefully so he could see her properly, this small, enormous person who had his dark hair and my stubborn expression already, somehow, in the set of her tiny jaw. "She looks like an argument," he said, very quietly. I laughed, and it hurt, and I didn't care. "Don't tell her that. I mean it as a compliment." He reached out and touched her hand, one finger, and her hand curled around it with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided this is her world, and everything in it is available to her. He went completely still. We stayed like that for a while. The room was warm and quiet and full of the beginning of everything. "Callum," I said. "Yes." His voice was not quite steady. I lied to everyone. At the beginning. I told them there was no father. I looked at him. I don't want to tell that lie anymore. He looked up from our daughter's face to mine. His eyes were very clear and very close. "No," he said. "No, you don't want me to stop?" "No," he said again, soft and definite. "No, there is a father. I am here. I have been here." He paused. "I plan to continue being here." I held his gaze. "There are other things I want to say, things I've been saving for after." "This is after," he said. I took a breath. Our daughter shifted on my chest, making the small shuffling noises of a person who has just arrived and is beginning to make sense of the world, her fist still wrapped around her father's finger. "I know," I said. "I'm getting there." He waited. He was very good at waiting. He had been waiting, in one form or another, since the night he answered on the second ring and drove 30 minutes to someone he barely knew and held them through a storm they hadn't caused. "I love you," I said. "I've been in love with you for a long time, since before she was a possibility, and I've been catastrophically bad at acknowledging it because—" I paused. "Because acknowledging it meant it could be taken away, and I've spent a long time making sure I didn't hold anything I could lose." He was very still. "But she's here now," I said, "and you're here. And I stopped. Tried the word out. "I'm not scared anymore. About the good kind of things." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he brought his free hand up and very carefully, with complete attention, pushed a piece of hair back from my face. His hand stayed there for a moment, warm against my temple. "I love you," he said. "I've been failing to say it for approximately 8 months, for the same kinds of reasons." A ghost of a smile. "We're going to be fine, Elliot, the three of us." The morning light was fully in the room now, the kind of clear, pale gold that early autumn produces when it remembers how to be generous. Our daughter, who did not yet have a name but had strong opinions about her father's finger, made a sound of imperial displeasure about being jostled, and then settled again. "We need to call my mother," I said. "We do. She's going to be insufferable about being right." "Probably. She told me last month," she said. "She said that the way you looked at me at the wedding was the way her father used to look at her mother, and that I was a fool if I let that go." Callum considered this. "I like your mother. She was right about the toast. She was right about most things, from what you've told me. Don't tell her that. She already knows, and it doesn't need encouragement." He smiled properly, the full one, the one that broke through the contained intensity and left something warmer underneath. And I thought, as I had thought in the kitchen at 6 months pregnant, and in the waiting room of the clinic, and at a party I had attended reluctantly in late autumn a year and some months ago, that I was in very significant trouble. The good kind. What comes after a beginning is simply more life, but life arranged differently. We did not move in together immediately. I had spent enough time building a self-sufficient architecture that dismantling it too quickly would have been the kind of emotional overreach I was still learning to avoid. Callum understood this, or said he did, which with him was the same thing. He kept his own flat, a 10-minute walk from mine, in a building with an interesting facade he'd once described to me at length, and he was at my flat most evenings and many mornings, and all of the nights when something woke our daughter at 2 and 4 and sometimes 6, and she required both parents to convince her that sleeping was an acceptable activity. We named her Rowan. It had been on a short list I'd been carrying around for months, and when I said it to Callum in the hospital room with her in his arms, he looked up and said, "Yes, that's right," with the decisiveness of someone recognizing something. My mother arrived at the hospital while I was still in the recovery period and entered the room with a casserole she had somehow produced between receiving my call and arriving. Because my mother approached every significant life event as a logistical problem requiring food. And she took one look at Callum sitting in the chair by the window, with Rowan against his chest and his eyes closed and his face entirely unguarded. And she turned to me with an expression that I correctly read as "I told you so" before she said a single word. "Don't," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said, setting the casserole on the counter. "You were absolutely going to say something." "I was going to say," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed and taking my hand, "that you look very well, and that she's beautiful, and that I'm proud of you." I looked at her. "That's all?" She looked across the room at Callum, still asleep in the chair with Rowan rising and falling with his breath. Something moved through her face that was complicated and fond. "That's all," she said. Declan came later that afternoon with Oliver, who had accepted the revelations of the previous months with the specific grace of someone who had been gently corrected by life about making assumptions, and who looked at Rowan with the slightly dazed expression of a man realizing that his own niece had arrived by a path he had not anticipated. "She has your face," he told Callum. "Elliot's jaw," Callum said. "Your ears. We should probably not do this in front of her. She'll develop a complex. She's 4 hours old. Best to start as you mean to go on." I watched them across the room. These two brothers, these people who were now woven into the life I was living, and I thought about the lie I had started with. 4 words in a kitchen on a Thursday evening. There is no father. I had said it to protect myself. I had said it because I was afraid that sharing something meant losing part of it. What I had learned, slowly and incompletely and not without cost, was that the opposite was sometimes true. That some things became more fully yours in the sharing of them. That the version of a life I had built in my head as a fortress, self-sufficient, unassailable, complete, was a smaller thing than the actual complicated, imperfect, gloriously overpopulated life that had insisted on building itself around me instead. Rowan was not the reason I loved Callum, though she was the reason the timing went as it did. I had begun to love him in a room full of strangers before any of this was possible. She was, rather, the reason I stopped being afraid to say it. She had arrived in the world with complete confidence in her right to be held, and she had apparently decided to make that the lesson. I was trying to learn it. 3 months after Rowan was born, Callum asked me a question. We were in my kitchen. It was always my kitchen. I noticed which said something about where the center of gravity had settled, and it was after dinner, which he had cooked because I had been working late on the report that had finally vindictively come together after the delivery had forced a month of concentrated work afterward. Rowan was asleep. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the city was doing its quiet evening thing. He was washing up, and I was sitting at the table, which is where I was always sitting, and he said, without turning around, "I've been thinking about the flat." "Your flat?" "Yes. What about it?" He turned off the tap, dried his hands, turned around to look at me, leaning back against the counter. "The lease is up in 2 months," he said, "and I've been—" He stopped, began again. "I've been thinking about whether to renew." I looked at him, he looked at me. "And?" I said, "and I wondered what you thought." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went by slowly. Upstairs, my neighbor walked across a room. "I think," I said carefully, "that my second bedroom currently has an inflatable mattress in it and your things are in the wardrobe." "That's true. And I think that Rowan has worked out how to identify which person is walking down the hall by the sound of the footsteps, which means she knows you're there at night, and if you stop being there." "It would confuse her," he agreed. "It would absolutely confuse her." A pause. "It's not a large flat," I said. "No. You would have to put up with my particular organizational system, which you have told me on several occasions is a controlled catastrophe," he said. "Yes, I've made my peace with it." I looked at him. This man who had answered on the second ring, who had driven through an early morning, who had made toast and asked what I needed and waited without claiming, who had held my hand in a hospital room and made a sound when the world broke open into something new. "Stay," I said. "Renew the lease or don't, but stay." He pushed off from the counter and came to the table and sat down across from me the way he had that very first morning in this same kitchen with this same table between us, both of us on the other side of something we hadn't fully understood we were beginning. He put his hand on the table, palm up. I put mine in it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. Outside, the city moved through its evening, unhurried and vast. Inside, there was warmth and the particular quiet of a shared place, and somewhere down the hall a small person sleeping with complete confidence in the world that held her. That is how the lie ended and how the real thing began. Not with a declaration, but with a hand on a table and a single agreed word. In a kitchen where all our most important conversations had taken place in the ordinary, unremarkable middle of a life that had become, against all my initial planning, astonishingly full. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.